Welcome to Voice for Values with Lyle Shelton.
Well, hello and welcome again to Voice for Values. It's Lyle Shelton from the Australian Christian Lobby. Thanks so much for your company. Many of you I know have been concerned about the so-called Safe Schools program. We've talked about it a lot on Voice for Values, and those who follow ACL will know this is a big issue. Well, I'm pleased to say that for today's program, I've got a very special guest, someone who's been courageous, speaking out, helping people understand what this issue of gender dysphoria, gender confusion is all about. And his name is Dr. John Whitehall, and he's a professor of paediatrics at the University of Western Sydney. You might have heard him in the media recently. He's on the line now. Professor Whitehall, thanks so much for joining us on Voice for Values today.
You're welcome.
Professor Whitehall, this whole issue of gender dysphoria and gender confusion has really hit our society quite suddenly, and suddenly it's in the news. We've got this Safe Schools program. What's going on at the moment in societies like Australia and America and in the West, where we suddenly have this whole transgender movement?
Well, what's going on? What's going on is very sad, and may I start by saying that children and families caught up in this business are in a great deal of trouble, great deal of emotional trouble. They deserve our compassion, and my heart goes out to them. By whatever I say, I'm not making any criticism of the people. I feel sorry for them, and I wish them the very best. However, in my opinion, there's a fad, and it's reflected in the increasing numbers of people, of children, being brought by their families to so-called gender dysphoria clinics. And the numbers are now in hundreds each year if you add up both Melbourne and Sydney and other places. That's hundreds of families deeply concerned over whether their child is in the body of the opposite sex and so forth. Is it really that common? Well, I've been in medicine for 51 years, and in writing up about this, I did a straw poll of 28 paediatricians. These are generalist paediatricians. They're not tucked away in some subspecialty. 28 with a cumulative exposure of 931 years. And between us, we remembered 8 cases. 6 of them were associated with a very severe emotional disturbance, including autism and other things. And another 2 had been grossly abused sexually for a long time. And it used to be that if a child was complaining of being of the opposite sex, that you thought, first of all, as to whether there was sexual abuse. Anyway, 28 paediatricians, 931 years, a total of 8 children. That's 1 in more than 100 years. And yet now we are led to believe there are hundreds each year. So what's going on?
Yeah,
I don't really know, but I think it's a fad. It's a fad fueled by the media and given substance by ready access to websites and other counseling services. And I think that it's an attractive thing for teenagers in their early years, which is the time of anti-authoritarianism, the time for standing out, the time for being difficult. And what better way to get up the nose of your parents than to go out and declare, well, I'm not the girl you thought you had, I'm actually a boy.
Professor Whitehall, this is extraordinary what you're telling us, and I so appreciate you starting off on a note of compassion to parents and families where this is an issue. And I think we've all seen examples of this in the media. I remember Channel 7 showing a family last year where the father, when he saw his boy with a kitchen knife about to cut off his penis, he allowed his boy to transition to a girl at school. I mean, this is the sort of heartache and grief that parents are going through and then wanting to go along to these clinics. It's coming from a place of deep concern by many parents, isn't it, where they're seeing these sort of things manifesting in their children?
Yes, it is. It's a major perturbation in the family, to use a medical term. But the good news...
What does perturbation mean?
It means really upset, disturbance, cataclysmic eruption, You can imagine if your daughter comes home and announces that she's a boy, and you know, if you've no look at them, you know of the websites that she can look at, and you know of the counselling people that will lead her in the direction of making an irreversible mistake. Could I just sort of move on to an optimistic note, and that is that international opinion, including the Bible of psychiatry, the Diagnosis and Statistical Manual of Mental Health, declares that 90% of children will grow out of it by the time they get to puberty. And indeed, many adolescents will grow out of it. They would argue that not all would grow out of it. But certainly with regard to those occurring in childhood, and these are the ones we see now as kind of poster children for the schools and poster children for the media, the international assurance is that if you just take it easy and don't make any irreversible decisions and don't stick the child further and further out into a position from which it can't return, then nature will turn the child back to the sex it was born with. So that's the good news. The bad news is that people are being seduced into going along with this, being part of the process of the social transitioning.
Folks, my guest today is Professor John Whitehall. He's Professor of Paediatrics at the University of Western Sydney. He's practiced in medicine for 51 years. He knows his stuff. We've got to go to a break. Please don't go away. We'll be back with Professor John Whitehall right after this.
Voice for Values at acl.org.au.
Well, welcome back to Voice for Values. My guest today is Professor John Whitehall, Professor of Paediatrics at the University of Western Sydney. Professor, you were telling us just before the break that 90% of children and adolescents, if just left alone, will come out on the other side of puberty quite comfortable in their biological gender. This is 90% of a very tiny percentage of children who will ever suffer from confusion about their gender. Am I correct in saying that?
Well, no, it's not a small percentage of those who are going to the clinics, and I don't have access to who's going to the clinics, but
no, I guess my point was, though, the number of children who suffer from gender dysphoria is a very small percentage of the overall cohort, and you're saying that 90% of this very small cohort will find their way through to being comfortable in their biological gender.
Yes, I'm saying those that present during childhood, the majority are going to grow out of it. Some of them won't, and reports from overseas are that those children will end up with homosexual orientation. I interviewed one of the men in Canada who was responsible for a lot of this basic work, and he went on to say, well, life as a homosexual is surely much easier than life of a transsexual on drugs that block puberty, drugs that evoke the characteristics of the opposite sex, mastectomies and genital mutilation, and a lifelong commitment to receiving medical care. That's the issue. And perhaps we should explain that. There are several stages then in this. The first stage might be called the social transitioning of the child, where you're identifying as the opposite sex, special toilets, and all that sort of stuff. That then is followed by what is called stage 1, which is the giving of medicines that interfere with that very complex process of neurotransmitters and hormones and so forth that cause puberty.
So you're talking about cross-sex hormones and puberty blockers in particular?
No, yeah, I'm talking about the puberty blockers, which are usually the first thing that is being given. And they then block the child in a prepubertal state. I mean, the recommendations are that they be given at the first onset of puberty, and then they will block it for as long as you give.
Are there side effects to intervening with these sort of chemicals in a child's...
Well, that's the issue. That is the big issue that I'm just writing about right now. The courts, and I've just reviewed the 60 or so cases that have come before the Family Court of Australia since 2004, repeated as a mantra by the judge on the basis of testimony of the involved doctors is that puberty blockers are safe and their effects are entirely reversible. And on the basis of that, the laws, essentially, the judicial decisions are based. Now, it's repeated every court case, but since the time that these people were first going to the court, that is in the 2000s, work had begun in places overseas looking at the effects of blockers on the brains of the recipients. And I'm in communication with people in Glasgow who are working with people in Oslo, and they have found in sheep, for example, that the blockers cause a pathological increase in size of the integral part of the brain that controls emotion and executive decision and those sorts of things, the limbic system. The limbic systems in pubertal sheep who receive the blockers are pathologically enlarged. That's the first thing. So then they looked at those things under molecular staining and found that the gene expression was very much disrupted. 100 genes that are going to cause various effects in those organs were overproducing, and about 200 were underproducing. This is an extraordinary thing when you think that one gene abnormality can really cause widespread pathology. So then, not illogically, they looked at what happened to those sheep when you put them in mazes and problem-solving things. Now, they're only sheep and they can hardly read or write, but they found that the sheep who had been blocked the females were much more emotionally labile, that the males were much more prone to risk-taking, and both of them were deficient in their spatial memory. Now, it's a very important thing for sheep.
Why aren't we being told about this at a safe school near us? I mean, we've got this Safe Schools program encouraging children not only to socially transition with their dressing, but to also head down a path of puberty blockers and even surgery. And yet the politicians who are funding this course and allowing access into the schools don't seem to be aware of this basic science.
Well, that's essentially the crux of the article that I'm writing now. Why is it that the medical profession, they're the ones responsible, are not reading the literature?
Are people fearful because this, and even medical professionals, because of the power of the LGBT rainbow political agenda? Is that why people who know the science are silent as all this is sweeping through our schools?
Well, I can't speak for the motivation of those who are testifying in the court, but they are virtually unanimous in this argument that there are no lasting effects of blockers. Why they're doing that, I cannot say. But the literature, which I have open in front of me in my computer now, and I've got reprints surrounding me writing this article, it is there for those who want to see. I don't know why they're not seeing. But there's more to it than that. The first stage then would be to block puberty, and then the next stage would be to evoke the secondary sex characteristics with the opposite sex hormones, testosterone if you're a girl or estrogen if you're a boy. So the question is, what effects does that have on the brain? Well, again, since 2004, you will not find anywhere in the court summaries from the expert witnesses that these things have a deleterious effect on the brain. Now, they'll talk about predisposition to clotting, blood pressure, and those sorts of things. No mentions on the brain. Okay, so I've been talking with people and plug into the computer, just look for these effects. Hang on a second. The literature has got many, many resources testifying that cross-sex hormones have a drastic effect on the brain. Just for example, mostly these are on males, and we'll just get to the possible effect on the younger person. If a male takes estrogen for only a period of 6 months, there is a measurable reduction in the size of the brain at a rate which is 10 times that of normal aging.
Gee.
After only 6 months.
Dr. Whitehall, I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to interrupt you at this critical juncture. Our time is gone for this episode, but I want to get you back on again next week. This is just absolutely fascinating. I think what you're talking about, to me, sounds like a scandal of enormous proportions because we have this Safe Schools program which our politicians are allowing, and we haven't even begun to discuss the effects of surgery yet. So let's get you back next week. Dr. John Whitehall, Professor of Paediatrics at the University of Western Sydney, thanks for joining us. I'm hoping that you can come back again next week.
Yeah, fine. I'm very happy. We'll continue it next week. No worries.
Voice for Values from the Australian Christian Lobby.